Hello, good afternoon, and thank you for joining Insight Legal for this webinar on AML and the SRA legislation on your obligations. My name is Josh Dallywell, and I'm one of three hosts on this call today. I'm kindly joined by my colleagues Deborah Whitkiss, who is the co-founder and Chief Operations Officer at Insight Legal, and Stephen Meinl, Business Development Manager, for this next 30 minutes. Good afternoon to both of you. I also have my colleagues, Gail and Nathan, who will be monitoring the chat and QA boxes on Zoom for your questions. Deborah, do you want to say hello and introduce yourself? I know that we have a real mix of clients and non-clients on this webinar, so there may be a fair few people who aren't aware of your role in founding Insight Legal.
Of course, thanks, Josh. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Deborah Whitkiss. I am the COO at Insight Legal, as Josh said. I have been at Insight since we started 10 years ago, 10 years this month, in fact. But before that, I came from legal practice, so a former legal cashier, practice manager, and software trainer, legal accounts trainer. So hopefully well placed to answer some of your questions later on in the webinar.
Excellent. And Stephen, you have a kind of a fair few years of experience in legal software.
Thank you, Josh, I think. No, thanks, Josh. Let me just quickly introduce myself. My name is Stephen Meinl, and I work as a business development manager within Insight Legal. As Josh indicated there, I've been in the legal market for close to a decade now. So I've seen how both technology has advanced, but also more importantly, how the legal market has started to really embrace these changes within their working environment.
Fantastic, thanks. Right, so what do we have in store for you today? We've got a full agenda. We're going to look at why there continues to be a focus on AML. We're also going to discuss measures you need to ensure that you remain compliant as far as your obligations as a law firm are concerned, and also what role technology can play in the reliability and constant of AML checks, ensuring a process is followed, and how you handle the documents and record what you have or haven't done for audit purposes. I should also mention that this webinar is being recorded, and we will be making a copy of the recording of this session available to everyone who has registered, and there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions to the panel here, and we promise if we do run out of time that we will reach out to the individuals directly whose questions we don't manage to cover. Questions submitted through Zoom can only be seen by the panelists, so please feel free to ask in confidence. Alternatively, you can reach us on webinars@insightlegal.co.uk, and we'll pick those up during this session. Okay, now you can argue that AML has really kind of never been too far from the headlines. Allegations from the Panama Papers to NatWest's involvement in laundering 365 million, not too small a sum there, have kept AML firmly in the spotlight. You also have financial challenges faced by law firms in a post-pandemic world where criminals have sought to take advantage of the disruption caused by COVID and the economic downturn. Firms in the past year have been more exposed than ever to the risk of being used for money laundering. Okay, COVID meant firms were forced to either reduce or furlough staff, some in order to remain viable businesses in an economic downturn, and made support, admin, and money laundering compliance roles redundant, and were therefore at higher risks. These changes could reduce their ability to carry out compliance and risk assessments, customer due diligence, and source of funds checks. Now, many firms will have found client due diligence, including appropriate levels of identification and verification, more difficult because of lockdowns and social distancing. For example, changing from face-to-face to online communication exposed firms to different risks, so they needed different methods to control them. Criminals, as we know, will take advantage of uncertainties and changing circumstances to deceive firms. Now, throw into this mix the stamp duty holiday and time pressures from home buyers and sellers and estate agents to meet certain deadlines with potentially a reduced number of staff. And you can see how mistakes, shortcuts, and oversights are made. Maybe not always with the intention of supporting criminal activity, but regardless of your intentions, any misconduct, negligence, or oversight is likely to be met with the same penalties by the SRA. Okay, now of the, let me just minimize the screen so you can actually see everything on the screen. So of the 69 firms visited in the year to April 2021, only 24% were found to have AML procedures and processes in place that were deemed to be fully compliant. Okay, 12% were not compliant with the AML regulations and were referred for investigation. Okay, in all, the SRA's AML team is currently dealing with 200 investigations, which range from straightforward non-cooperation by firms right up to really complex investigations relating to international fraud or terrorist financing. Property transactions, not surprisingly, were the most common cause of investigations, while some of the factors that contributed to the need for enforcement action were not training or supervising fee earners, but having inadequate policies, procedures, and controls, or individuals not following them. Out of the 241 files reviewed by the SRA, 103 did not contain appropriate source of funds checks. That's nearly a quarter of firms did not have a source of funds policy at all. Okay, now you can look at the data here and it doesn't make for great reading. More than 10% of law firms whose compliance with anti-money laundering laws was checked by the SRA in the last year have been referred for investigation. Now, I want to bring in my colleague, Deborah, to discuss this. Debs, are you surprised by any of this?
I wish I could say I was, Josh. Well, I suppose I was a little surprised by the numbers, by the high percentages there, but I'm definitely not surprised that a good number of law firms have been struggling and continue to struggle. Obviously, the uncertain financial climate, the changing legal landscape have made it more and more difficult for firms to judge the evolving risks and update their risk assessment policies and internal procedures as well. As you mentioned, some firms have been working with fewer staff. Perhaps your money laundering compliance officer has been made redundant, or perhaps was or still is on furlough. Perhaps your back office or finance staff the same. So much has changed for law firms. They really have had a lot on their plates, more so than usual. As you said, changing from sort of face-to-face to online communication, maybe relocating staff to home working, moving IT systems to the cloud so that people can access them from home. They're things that firms have had to contend with, but also they're things which expose them to a larger number of risks and to different risks that they perhaps had to contend with before. And it's so difficult to risk assess when you're in a situation that's so unknown, which of course the pandemic definitely counts as that. And as you mentioned, firms who do conveyancing, some of the most at risk because of the nature of their work, because of the volume of the transactions that they deal with. That SDLT holiday, as if the pressure from that wasn't enough just from a workload point of view, it's just put firms under more and more pressure. Their clients are sort of wanting to speed up the process, wanting to get things in, and not specifically asking them necessarily to not do those client due diligence procedures, but just to speed things up. So it's hard enough to deal with the transactions, but also firms have just got to take that time to deal with their own policies, their own firm-wide processes and procedures. And then you look away from areas such as conveyancing, which have been so busy, and you look to areas which have been quieter. So with the decline in available work in some areas of law, I think some firms have felt pressured to take on all the work that comes their way just to keep their business ticking over, if you like. But AML awareness isn't just about making sure that you've checked the ID of the client or checked the source of the funds, but it's also making sure that you're not breaching the accounts rules by treating your bank account as a banking facility. Everything needs to be supported by an underlying legal transaction. So, if a client approaches you to take on a matter outside of your area of expertise, or a case that maybe involves large amounts of money changing hands with no requirement for substantive advice, they're all enormous red flags, but they are ones which a surprising number of firms are actually being caught out by. And the trouble is, as understandable as these pressures are, it is, of course, an offence not to carry out the appropriate anti-money laundering controls.
Fantastic. Thanks, Debs, for that. And I guess in terms of what the SRA legislation on, on client due diligence and AML, it kind of broadly fits across 5 key areas. And where law firms fall foul of, is really in terms of kind of partial compliance, is that they tick only 1 or 2 of these boxes. And obviously the most basic CDD checks will involve confirming the identity of your client, which basically means verifying they are who they say they are. And this is usually through a new client providing photographic identity through a passport or a driver's license. Now, with COVID restrictions in place, how many firms were content they were fulfilling those requirements by asking clients to email in a photo or a scan of their passport, and what risks does that continue to pose? I'll use my own example here, actually. I hired a van recently, okay? Now, not the most complex of transactions, but as part of the hiring process, I needed to show up with my driver's license and a recent utility bill as proof of my address. Now, I'm reasonably tech savvy and being conscious of my environmental footprint. I use an app on my phone to do my banking. My electricity, water, and my Virgin broadband bills come to me each month by email, or I have to log on to a portal to download them. But however, sitting in the reception at Romsey Van Hire, I was conscious that I'd printed out my bills, and partway through page 2, the printer started to struggle. So there were a few streaky paragraphs on page 2 of my identity. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, there is no way this guy is going to let me hire a van. And yet, this is as far as the checks some law firms will go to verify the identity of their client before representing them in a transaction, which in some cases may involve hundreds of thousands of pounds. Source of funds is identifying how and where did the client get the money. It's not enough to know that the bank, the funds are coming from a UK bank. As with the recent case of NatWest, we know that banks are not averse to accepting dirty money, but their failings are not an excuse for you not to perform your checks on how the funds came about into their bank account. Firms, we know, now regularly have a source of funds form that they require a new client to complete, providing copies of bank statements, pay slips, but how many fail to check that the funds being deposited with the law firm are actually from the same bank, let alone the same account that the client has provided as their source of funds, okay? And how do you deal with funds being transferred from an individual's accountant or another law firm? These are all important considerations. And if you are the subject of an SRA or NCA audit, are you confident being able to provide evidence that checks have been conducted? So if you do find yourself, on the wrong side here, can you, I guess the audit will look at you and think, well, actually, you're guilty until proven innocent, because unless you can provide evidence that you have conducted any checks and documented those, and where required, asked questions as to the source of funds and documented the client's response, it is possible to assume that none of that actually took place. And there is kind of so much that falls into this grey area of perception, okay? which is the client cooperative? What inquiries did you actually make? Is the client being deliberately evasive? Does the amount of funds match the client profile? Is there a satisfactory explanation? If it's an inheritance, do you have copies of the will or probate? How did the benefactor gain the funds? Are the fees being discussed, as Deb's mentioned, in accordance what you would normally charge? Is it the right level of work that you would normally do? And these are all kind of red flags. How long have you known the client? Is the work being carried out fit the profile of the client? Is any money involved in the transaction coming from a country that's deemed to be high risk? Where are the funds for your fees being paid from? Is it your client? Is it a third party, a foreign country? And really, are you satisfactory with your findings? You need to keep a record of all customer due diligence measures that you carry out, including customer documents that you've obtained. Now, by keeping comprehensive records, you'll be able to show that your business has complied with the money laundering regulations. This is obviously crucial to protect your business if there's an investigation into one of your customers. And you need to ensure that those records are kept for 5 years, really kind of beginning from the date of a business relationship ends or the date a transaction is completed. Now, as well as doing your checks for each transaction, you must also properly identify and check the suitability of your employees and also supervise their work. You must make sure that your business has adequate internal controls and monitoring systems that should alert you if criminals try to use your business for money laundering. Now, once you've been made aware of a potential threat, you can take steps to prevent it and report any suspicious activity. Okay, and essentially, kind of what your controls should do is include things like appointing a nominated officer and making sure that your employees know who to report any suspicious activity to, appointing a compliance officer, identifying the responsibilities when something is escalated to a senior manager, training relevant employees on their AML responsibilities, documenting and updating your policies and controls, and also kind of introducing measures to make sure that the risk of money laundering is taken into account in the day-to-day running of your business. Okay, there's also a requirement that firms these days have complete a policy statement for your business, and part of that policy statement includes your AML policy. Again, what the controls and procedures you take as a business to prevent money laundering. And the document also can provide a framework for how your business will deal with the threat of money laundering. You should name relevant people or individuals and set out their responsibilities. Even if your business is small, it's a useful tool for focusing your mind and those of your employees, if you have them, to make them constantly aware of the risk. Okay, and also that should also lay out what do you do. So if you are suspicious that you're being asked to be party in a suspicious transaction, what should you do? The obvious thing is to report that to the SRA and the appropriate law enforcement, whether that be the police or the NCA. Any concerns about you carrying out work which suspects might be linked to either fraudulent or criminal activity. There is also a recommendation in the SRA legislation that if you have suspicions about a transaction, that you take precautions not to jeopardize any actions, or any future actions by law enforcement by tipping off the client, either directly or inadvertently, and not to proceed on any grounds unless you've been given some defense against AML. Now, I want to bring in my colleague Stephen here for this next part on what role technology has to play and show us how you conduct ID AML checks through Insight using Veriphy, which is our integration partner. Stephen, thanks for being patient.
No problem, that's wonderful. So thanks for that, Josh. What I'll do is I'll just quickly share my screen. And then the purpose of this section is to show you how technology can work within your organization to really assure a very simple and effective way to implement AML ID checking within the system. Okay. So as I say, the purpose is I'm going to show you how simple it is and how a process can be run within Insight. But firstly, before I want to do that, I just want to cover very briefly how we can get some monitoring and visibility of the AML ID checks. So within the legal market, and as I say, in business development, I come across this more and more regularly, workflows are becoming more and more commonplace throughout utilizing the file. So that may be, for example, going through, if we take a conveyancing file, the gather information, the searches and checks, the inquiry stage. However, to really push forward that potential for measurability, visibility, and to ensure everything's being monitored, we can actually implement things such as the AML check throughout that workflow process. So really think of the whole thing as saying, actually, yeah, let's utilize these things such as workflows and ensuring that this is done at the correct stage at the correct time. So really, I just wanted to mention really how workflows can really implement the whole process of that. But what I'm going to do now is really show how quickly and simple AML ID checks can be done throughout the system, and really sort of say, why aren't they being done? So there's two really key ways Insight can do your AML checks. So if I just close this off at the moment. So we have a very simple button which says ID AML. So we simply check on that. And what you'll see is the whole process. You'll talk through the stages, and this will prevent any mistakes or any errors happening. So what we want to do is very simply perform the check. Okay, and we want to do an AML credit check. Again, the benefit is if you're not being taken out to third-party software, not being taken out of the system, everything is performed here. So again, it makes it simple and effective. So what it's asking us first of all to do is input some basic information. So we just simply follow the process through. Okay. I'll put my date of birth in there, so please no laughing, and my gender here. And then obviously it takes us to the next stage. It's asking for the address. So we just simply follow this through. And the benefit of this is if we miss out any key areas, it won't let us go through to the next stage. So apologies about the speed of typing, but we'll get there. It's now asking us to put in some basic communications information, which I will do. And my email address, which has to be one of the longest emails addresses. So I do apologize about that. But hopefully you can see already how it's talking us through the process. We're not missing anything vital. We then go on to the important area, which is the ID area. Now, a couple of real great benefits here. And again, to prevent any miskeying of information, which again, delays the process, is for example, asking us for the passport number. And if we see here, we have a little information tab, and it's actually telling us or showing us exactly what information we can input. And that again negates any errors which can delay any file opening process. And again, simpler for the same for the driving license. But in this case, I'm just going to simply put in a made up national insurance number. We're happy with everything there, so we simply click on next. And it's telling us we haven't missed any information. So that's fantastic. We know we're all good to go. So we simply submit the check. And now we're just waiting for that. It's going to actually perform the check with Veriphy. Again, it's not taking us out of the system. Everything's done within there. It's just running the check. Just wait for that to come through. That simply now comes through. So what we can see now on the right-hand side is the return of that check. Okay, so it's giving us all the information we keyed in there, but it's actually telling us there is an issue. So straight away we know, and here we've got a failure. We know there's something wrong there. So we can reevaluate that information and perform the new check with the correct information as we should go forward. Now, if we're happy with everything, we can simply go, that's fine. And again, to prevent any the need to repeat any keying of information, we can simply create a client within the system by clicking on the Create Client button. And again, we've created the client from the information we've input into the system. The important factor here is, as we mentioned about compliance, is we want to keep a record that we've conducted that AML check. As Josh mentioned earlier, historically, maybe we get an email which we filed, a piece of paper which we put in a desk drawer, and there's no actual compliance or there's no audit trail that we've completed that AML check. So we can see down here, the check has been created on the 21st of the 10th at 12:54 by myself. We can also quickly view that check as well, so we can see the data we've created here. Okay. The other important thing to note, for compliance purposes, is we cannot go there and then create or print out that data and change it. It's saved within the system. We can't change any of the data there. We have a secure access to the information we put in there. Okay. The other way we can utilize the system is obviously if we've already created the client, we can simply perform the ID AML check based on the client's information we've already put to the system. And again, the same principle we've done is simply asking us to do the performance check, click on next. And in this case, rather than having to key in the information, it's pulled the information through from Insight. We can simply go there. It's asked us to import the address, so we need to put another address in, we can do. We can simply import that. Again, communications, methods, import that. ID, we can again put in the national insurance number. Click on next. And once again, we can submit the check as we've seen before. And they're as simple as that process. So we can very simply see, by utilizing the technology of the system, we can run that AML check. It gives us an audit that check has been provided, and the minimum time is utilized to do that. So really, there's no excuse to actually go through and not do the AML check. And then by implementing the technology such as workflows, we can get a very good ability to report, visibility and measurability of the AML checks have been completed. So hopefully that's given you a sort of very brief overview of the AML checking within the system.
And I think there's a kind of a few things to pick up there. One is that obviously, as you mentioned, there's no excuses not to do that. That check came back in what was literally a matter of seconds, and obviously it's flagged up that that one particularly failed, and obviously so there are some red flags there. But also it's also important to bear in mind here what your internal process for escalation is should anybody any of your clients fail those checks. But also you can actually do this retrospectively. So if you've got clients within Insight already that you haven't necessarily done those checks on, and again it takes only a matter of seconds to conduct those checks through here. Okay, and I think of particular importance also is when we talked about, when you Stephen, when you kind of showed the kind of the workflow stage, is actually that you can actually have a formal process of onboarding new customers, which which you can start with. Actually, have you carried out the appropriate checks? There's an audit trail which shows you who conducted those checks, and there's also the ability to reassign tasks within workflows as well. So we're soon to be approaching the holiday season. Actually, I was going to say we're also kind of approaching the sickness season with winter approaching, which means that if people are off sick or on holiday, you can see what tasks as part of an AML onboarding process haven't been completed, and if required, who do they need to be reassigned to, as opposed to ignored altogether. Okay, fantastic. Thanks for that, Stephen. I'm going to take back control over the screen so we can get back to here. And I guess kind of what I want to talk about next is really kind of what is the goal with any effective AML process. Okay, and I think firstly it should be to ensure that everyone in the firm responsible for onboarding new clients is aware of the risks, and that all relevant checks are carried out, process is followed, and the supporting documents are accessible by all who need them, as Stephen mentioned, as opposed to sitting on a desktop somewhere or an email. And an auditable trail exists containing records of communication and evidence supplied. You'll need to ensure that records are updated and maintained, and there be no assumptions that if someone's been a client for several years that certain checks don't need to be carried out or can be circumnavigated. Criminals have been known to infiltrate law firms, build trust and relationships with law firm staff with the intention of money laundering. It needs to be efficient. We know that that technology platforms like Veriphy can return results back in a matter of seconds, and files stored on the case and client file, as opposed to the traditional way of collecting, scanning documentation and manually filing documents. Fee earners know more than anyone that time is money and money is time. You reduce the risk by ensuring that regardless of who is completing the checks, the correct process is followed, and anyone can see what checks have been completed and by whom. Again, coming back to the role of technology, the ability to reassign tasks where someone is either unavailable, on leave, or on simply away, okay, to ensure nothing falls through the cracks. And with automation, you can standardize and optimize this process to ensure that every check is submitted with all of the right information and every time. So imagine how much time could be saved when the involved parties don't have to be tracked down and followed up for missing information. And there are no mistakes made when manually having to input data, or not manually having to input data from one system to the other. And should you find yourself under audit or under investigation, that your processes are irrefutable, and you save yourself from a lengthy, potentially expensive and damning investigation. Okay, now we have time for a few questions, and Deborah and Stephen, please feel free to jump in with your thoughts on these. I'm just going to see if it looks like we've got a couple of questions that have come through.
We've had a few really good questions actually in the chat there. I don't know if you want me to start with one, Josh, while you catch up on the...
Yeah, sure. Do you want to take the first one?
Them. So, I mean, I'm not sure if people have been able to see these in the chat anyway, but so the first question was about the AML checks that we do in Insight, and do they leave a footprint on the client's file? And actually, I've just reread the question saying, does it leave a footprint on the client's credit file? So I think we may have maybe slightly given the wrong answer to that question. In terms of, do they leave a footprint on the client's file within Insight, so that the matter itself? Yes, absolutely they do. As Stephen went on to demonstrate there, you can attach the AML check to the client's record so it remains visible. Even if you choose not to add that person as a client, so if you're doing this process before you've created a client record on the system, you can still keep the AML check record and the credit check record. It's just not attached to the client's file if you haven't created one. In terms of, does it leave a footprint on the client's credit file? If you are just doing an ID check, then I believe the answer is no to that one. If it's an AML and credit check, then my best guess is that yes, it probably does, but that's one that I'll take away, and we will speak to Veriphy just to confirm that.
Okay, and I have another question here, which is there an extra cost for this service? Okay, so I can take that one. That's fairly straightforward one. For our enterprise customers, the integration with Veriphy is available. It does mean that you do pay Veriphy directly, so we're not an intermediary in that transaction, neither do we take a commission for on any checks that you do through Veriphy, and it's a very straightforward one. If you type in Veriphy pricing, that will take you through to a list on their website in terms of the cost for each one of the checks. If you do find yourself logged into Insight and you see the ID AML section kind of grayed out, it may be that you are a non-enterprise customer, and I will be sharing our contact details at the end here for any questions or anybody interested in the enterprise features. I've got another question here, which is, what about international persons and companies? That's a good one.
I can answer the one on international persons, if that's the right way to phrase it. Yep. Yes, that's absolutely fine. So where we may have the space there for passport number, for example, and the example given was an English passport number, or sorry, British passport number, but it doesn't have to be. International passports are accepted exactly the same. Companies, and that's something I will need to check on. I will, again, we'll need to just take that one away. Not sure.
Okay, perfect. So I know, I think we did say at the beginning that if there's any questions from this session that we aren't able to answer directly, we will take those away and we will follow up with everybody individually who has asked them. I'm conscious of the fact that we've kind of gone slightly over time, and people's time is obviously valuable. Debs, I kind of want to bring you in here I guess to share a story that you shared with me last week, actually, when we were discussing this webinar, and of, I guess, kind of a real life situation that you've been aware of. Fortunately, it wasn't an Insight Legal client.
No.
Touch wood. And but obviously, where, for example, not conducting the appropriate checks has actually, ended with somebody being in prison. Is that correct?
It is, yeah. It's maybe not. I don't know. I'm not sure whether this is an amusing story or just a terrifying one, frankly. But from many years ago, actually, when anti money laundering was a fairly new thing, or certainly sort of new on the radar. An Irish solicitor who was undertaking a transaction for a new client, had a telephone call from a potential client to take on, I believe it was a property transaction, and he was just progressing through with the case, asked the client to come in with his proof of identification, all the usual things. Perhaps I think it's perhaps even before the days of these great things like the online checks, when it was a case of go in with your passport or your driving license. So the solicitor asked the questions, when you come in and provide your proof of ID. But there was always a reason why not, always a reason why he couldn't come in. There was no other reason really to suspect anything, but the solicitor carried on with the transaction. To cut a very long story short, it emerged after completion had taken place that the reason that the client couldn't come in and provide his proof of ID was that he was actually on remand for bank robbery, and the proceeds of that bank robbery had obviously gone into purchasing that property. It was then clean money. That solicitor went to jail. They did not. It wasn't just a case of being struck off. It was also, you could argue, not something that they were party to. It wasn't for their own sort of financial gain, apart from this, just dealing with this conveyancing transaction, but really horrific consequences for that solicitor. So I'm not sure whether that's a sad story or a funny story, but either way, it just goes to prove really how serious and significant these obligations are.
Exactly, and I think it kind of reinforces one of the kind of points we made earlier, which is that, not always do kind of solicitors get involved in, I guess, these kind of activities with the intention of supporting criminal activity. But regardless of your intentions, any shortcuts that you do take, may be seen as misconduct by the SRA. Okay. Now, in terms of, I guess, kind of next steps, I mentioned earlier we will be sharing a copy of the video recording of this, so keep an eye out for that link, which will be going out on email to everybody who's registered, whether you attended or not. Anyone watching this as a live session or recording and you'd like a demo of the Insight Legal integration with AML checks, or you want to understand how to put together a process for onboarding new clients using a workflow, please feel free to contact me directly or use the email address for the webinar team that you see on the screen in front of you, which is webinars@insightlegal.co.uk. On our next webinar, we will be discussing the virtues of time recording and 4 ways to time record in Insight Legal. I want to say thank you to my fellow panelists and to you for participating in this webinar, and enjoy the rest of your day.